watch the material for the efficient tests with Java. And actually this session, unlike some other material, is not only on EE like Jakarta or MicroProfile or Quarkus. And you also have the opportunity to have a look into Spring and all these things. So we're going to cover that as well. And I hope this is going to be interesting for you. So we have a few questions that came in already, and which I will cover first. And then, of course, we have a look into the live chat and all these things, whether that works. And I'm very much looking forward. So we're going to start with the questions here that came in on this GitHub issue. I thought that's an easy thing to have our questions here. And also, besides that, I posted the link into the live chat where you can have these Slido chats and polls available, so you can have a look into that and then just post some questions there, and also whether they have been answered appropriately. So let's go for the first question. How to write tests so that we can change the application logic without any problems, because it happens that we cover the code with tests and then it turns out that we have to change something. And yeah, that is actually a big, let's make this bigger just for you. That is a huge issue that we see in projects, especially if we have unit tests that are a little bit too much coupled to the actual production code. Or not only unit tests, it's basically always when we have code level tests. So I claim, if you watch the later episodes of the course, it shows how to do efficient end-to-end testing. If you have system tests, you probably have less this issue because you're literally connecting to your application locally in the same way like a user would. But it very much happens here if you do this in code level tests. So for example, I had, let me show this first, what we have in the notation with use case testing here in the article series, because it shows this diagram that I want to show you. Basically, imagine you have a class like a coffee shop. That is a class in your production code, and this order processor is a dependency of this class. And now the question is, okay, how to actually model these and mock these and set this up and make sure that the order processor behaves appropriately if we would like to test this coffee shop use case or the use case methods here. And now that's an interesting question because there's a lot of test technology like Spring context testing and things like that trying to set this up for you and trying to auto-wire and trying to help you. Which can be quite helpful, but honestly there's a lot of logic to be done in order not only to set up the mocking like this order processor, but also how to basically how it should behave during the test. So in this case, what we have a look at is our use case test here. So that is basically what I set up here, what I also described in my book as component tests or use case tests actually, that you set up these test doubles that reside in the test scope. So that's an interesting thing, and this is actually not really coupled to your test technology, so that's just Java code. You can do this with any approach. But basically what it does, it sets up all of the logic here that you need in these reusable test components. And yeah, this does it pretty much by hand, manually, just mockito.mock and when, then, and all these things. So there are even easier ways out there. For example, Mockito Runner or Spring Runner with Quarkus, you can do similar things. But the point here is that you want to have this wiring logic and also this, like when, then logic, this verification logic only once. So that's an important thing, and then we can use this just in our use case test. So this is actually the test scenario that we want to have, and then we simply say .createOrder, .verifyCreateOrder. And how you verify it is actually not part of this test scenario. So that is the difference. Why? Well, here if you see these three classes, then you say, well, congratulations, you now have three classes instead of one or something like that. But the point is, you don't see the benefit until you have a more complex project where you actually have hundreds of these test cases. And that's exactly the point, right? If you only, going back to the question, if you only have, an application logic or a test with a bunch of classes or something like that, then you don't really see the benefit. But in more complex, in real world projects, you do, because you have a lot of tests and a lot of production logic that changes. And now, in case of this example, or to get back to the question, if we go, for example, to the coffee shop, which is now our production class, and now we refactor something, right? We don't use the entity manager directly, we use another delegate, or we change this here and how the order processor is communicated with, then we don't have to throw away all of our tests, or refactor all of these hundreds of test methods. So here there are only 2, but imagine we have many of these classes and many of these methods, because we have a complex project. Then we don't need to modify all of them. We basically modify these things. So again, actually that's nothing new. It's just code quality and separations of concerns and abstraction layers applied to the test code as well. So to the test project as well, not just in production code, right? In production code we do this all the time, but then in test code, people think it's not really allowed, but actually it's not only allowed, but it's a very good idea to do it in the same way. So let me have a quick look at the Q&As and polls. So you can also feel free to put into the chat if that answers your question in all this. And then otherwise we just go on to the next one, because in streaming there's always a short delay, right? So just shout in the chat if you have a follow-up question, or you can use this Slido application where I posted the link. That's quite helpful to put in follow-up questions. Hi Sebastian, how would you change the coffee order system class to test the JAX-RS endpoint secured by JWT tokens? Yes. Would you use a key cloak or something else? Depends. So the question is if we have some authentication, if that is actually secured by JWT, then of course we have a little bit more complex setup. And then your application could be, like OpenLiberty, could be Quarkus, could be Spring. In this case, it's referred to microprofile. So Quarkus and OpenLiberty, for example, support these. Then they would include authentication as well, and then your system test would need to deal with that. Now, the question I would have is, depends what you want to test. So whether your test scenario basically includes the whole, like end-to-end setup, including the proper authentication, then in your case, yes, I would use something like Keycloak, or actually what you use in production also, to start that either in a local Docker container, that's probably the easiest, and then simulate that, maybe with test users or something like that. Or if you don't really care about your authentication in this particular test, you just say, okay, whatever, I just take a test user that is allowed to do these things, and then it works as well. You can have a look into these 2 things. So that is the guide of Quarkus. Let me make this bigger. Of the JWT, how to set that up, and also it explains in a basically test class setup how to do this in like in a test-like setup. So you can create some test keys and things like that, just in a that you can reuse in test code. So if you want to create a key that is allowed, for example, to use all these things, the same is available here. These are the OpenLiberty docs. Where there is a guide, secure microservices with basically same JSON Web Tokens, also uses microprofile, and in this case it also shows you, I open this here, the test code that you will set up for the test environment that just sets test users. So this is basically what I would do, depending on your setup, either having something similar to production, or having something with a fake user just in order to use this. Hope that answers your question. And we can go on to the next one and also have a look into the polls into the QAs. Let's see, there's already a question there. That's great. I would go through these ones first. So, question via Twitter: what is your take on Java Enterprise or Spring or some legacy JBoss or microprofile or maybe reactive Java? Yeah, a lot of things. So what my take on these, in the scope of testing, I would actually say it doesn't matter that much, because I've been involved into a lot of Spring projects in the past as well, and the issues that I see when it comes to testing are pretty much the same. It really doesn't matter that much. And also, there are similar solutions out there, like something like Spring Tests in Java Enterprise or MicroProfile. You can also start up something like that. You can start up an embedded environment. What is much more important is the approach that you use. So actually what I explained in the video courses, that you have fast feedback, that you have some test setup where I can actually quickly just execute your tests. Maybe you have a hot reload environment available, and then the latter is where it is, there's a little bit of difference how modern your runtime is. So for example, when it comes to Java Enterprise, JBoss, actually not 100% sure whether JBoss itself standalone supports a hot reload mechanism. Maybe you might use something like JRebel in this case if you have to, if you're using a somewhat older JBoss or any other application server runtime. In the case of Quarkus, it supports a development mode. OpenLiberty supports a development mode. Spring as well, if you use, I think it's called Spring Dev Tools or something like that. If you have an extra tooling. With MicroProfile, yes, depends on the runtime. And reactive Java is, I would say, for the sake of testing, that's just a different interface that you use then for your tests if you do end-to-end tests, for example. If you have some legacy runtime, then it really depends how quickly you can start your application servers. Just for the sake of being able to run it quickly. With productivity. Otherwise, you always have to wait long, or you have even an environment that you cannot Dockerize locally or something like that. So that is pretty much the point. Other than that, my take when it comes to testing, I would say it's very, very similar, especially with these frameworks that make your test that start up these embedded test environments, where I always would be cautious just for the sake of getting fast feedback. So typically starting something locally, even for Spring, same story, is faster in terms of feedback. An email question came in. What about the separation of the projects? Why are you using this extra system test project, including source code? Yes, so that refers to the project that I set up and showed in my course, which basically has this coffee shop, and this is probably too small to show you. It has a coffee shop project and a coffee shop -st for system test project. Why? So these projects are both separate. This one is actually, the system test one is just a standalone Java project, and it has no connection to the production project. Why? That is a quite handy separation to not accidentally have some connection to the production code where you make one changes on one side and you don't see the other changes on the other side because you accidentally make changes on both sides. For example, if you have a simple example for a JAX REST resource that emits some orders, so that's mapped to JSON, for example. And then if I would change something here, like the JSON-B mapping, how that is mapped, and change it, only in this class, and the class would be reused in multiple things, then I actually might accidentally break the contract of the API without realizing it. So what I want here explicitly is to say I have a project here. It's totally independent. It also could be a totally different technology. You can write bash scripts if you want, or Python or something else. It just has to speak JSON and HTTP for my project here. And then you can do this, basically you're separated. And the same is true for this order, for example. I have all of my types just as string. Why? Because it's easier and sufficient for my system test. Here I really don't care. I say something like create order and just create that coffee order, put it into the system, and so on and so forth. And I don't really care whether that is type safe enum or not, because my test will fail if it's not espresso anyway. So I can be a little bit more flexible here, but the point is I really want to separate that. So that is separate in all of these system clients that connect to this coffee order and all these things. So that is totally standalone. In the beginning, I could reuse some code if I want, but more like copy and paste, in terms of, in this case, on purpose, to not accidentally have some garbage in, garbage out problems here. So that is basically the purpose. And then you can start this up, in any way that is just convenient. In theory, it would make no difference if you put the same into the production code, but then you just run into the danger, right? If you type order and hit autocomplete in your IDE, it might import the wrong one or something like that. So that's why. All right. I hope you're doing well. Oh, we're getting a lot of questions. That's happy to hear that. By the way, I also hope you're doing well in this current situation. So that's a little bit crazy for all of us. And Yeah, I'm glad that you have the time to join at this hour. And yeah, next question. Via email came in. Your use case test approach with plain JUnit runner makes sense, uh, but wouldn't it further improve the code quality to add, yeah, Spark or Groovy testing or actually any other test framework? In general, yes. This would it would be a question where I say, okay, I would have a little bit a look into the trade-off of these things, like actually how much effort does it add if I add Groovy or Spark in this case, just for the sake of having a little bit, don't get me wrong, but syntactical sugar. Because what I see in projects is, and that is the biggest problem I see with testing. If you listen to webinars, haha, or blog posts or something like that, that you have a lot of, I call it hello world driven testing. Because then the examples you get is like, oh, hello world and a few like getters and setters and whatnot, and then you have some code where it actually makes a lot of difference because you only see the test scenario basically. So something like this, you only see one class, and it does make a difference whether you use Mockito yourself or whether you have a nice annotation or some groovy code that is even more concise. But for a real world project, actually, it's much more important to care about the proper code quality, like delegation, separation of concerns, abstraction layers, and then only in the last end care about that tiny little last layer of which test framework to choose. Should I use plain JUnit, or do I want some Groovy and some Spark? And all of these are nice technologies, right? So if you enjoy working with them, and especially if your team is used to using them, that's totally fine. Please go ahead and use them. So like I wrote in my article series, the only constraint I would set is basically to say, okay, have a few constraints here for tests that they need to execute, verify very quickly. And for me, the gold standard for that is JUnit, because it runs hundreds of cases literally in milliseconds. So that is really fast. And for me, that is a big advantage. And then if you structure your test code not nicely, properly, then you get this efficiency and maintainable tests anyway. And then if you want, more like the icing on a cake, you can add a different test technology as well, but only if it's basically still, if these principles are still true then. So for me, that would be somewhat a prerequisite. Other than that, if you're happy with like any other of these technologies, yes, please go ahead, and if it helps you, that's definitely helpful then. Also, is there an approach to use test containers with your approach of a local system test that gives short feedback nor startup time? Yes. So what questioner is referring to is that local system test setup, where I basically start my application plus the database and all these things once per work session, if you want, per development session, and then keep it running, and basically just say, make a hard reload or just restart my system test that only connect against something that is already running. Approach to use test containers. Yes, I was surprised and delighted to hear that actually there is something coming up in the beginning of this year, started somewhat. A post by Sergey, who works on test containers, that now they're actually evaluating something, and it's already possible to basically start containers with Java without the whole integration and tangling into your test lifecycles. So this is mostly what I'm a little bit unhappy about, that most test technology are really married with your test classes and your test code, and you cannot easily separate the life cycles then. So that makes it a little bit harder to build that up efficiently, because either you have to make some workaround, like check whether a thing is already running and then so on, or you cannot really reuse the tests. And what this then does is, you can have a look at the post. It starts up your Docker containers with a nice Java API basically, and you can have something like a public static void main instead of the script that I'm using. So if you watch the material you saw, I just used some bash scripts with it sounds very pragmatic and hacky, but still I have to somewhat find yet a simpler way, rather than except Docker run. And in this case, even with some nice connection to, I use Quarkus here with the remote dev approach. And once you get past the script, that's actually the easiest way, I think. If you prefer a Java syntax and the nice connection that you have, hey, my test containers knows about Postgres, and it has this as activation, this wait strategy, that's the name. So it will wait until that is ready, and that's already integrated. That's nice. And if you use such approach, then I would agree, then say, yeah, sure, use Java to start these. It's the same. For me, to be honest, command line or bash scripts is just easier. It's more pragmatic locally, but that's totally fine. But I would advise to use such an approach, and not an approach where you always tangle the lifecycle, so that you're independent. And then you can start up your test environment in whichever way you like. For example, using this Java test containers approach. So I think that would be a solution that makes you happy. In this case, let me just quickly refresh. Yeah, these are all of the questions here. So let's have a look into the Slido questions. All right. Why Jakarta is not, let me make this big. Why Jakarta has not very important part for productivity testing. Some serious platforms, Spring Boot has, Quarkus has, Java EE, why? Yes. I would partly agree. I mean, I fully agree that we don't have a productive setup there. But in some ways, I'm not even sure whether I would be 100% happy with what Spring does with testing and what Quarkus does with testing. Don't get me wrong; these are great technologies, and I'm happy that there's something there that helps developers how to get started. But once you want to have a little bit more productive setup, then for both approaches, either if you have code level tests that trying to fire up some environment, like Spring tests that start up your Spring application context and all that, and same for Quarkus, they don't run as efficiently like very plain JUnit would do, similar to these use case tests that I just showed. And on the other hand, an end-to-end test where you say you start up Quarkus or Spring Boot in like the production-like setting, where you always tangle your tests with this startup method, then it's also not fast enough, because you always, for each and every test execution, have to wait these few seconds until that is up and running. I don't want to complain too much. It's really great that we have the technology that actually can start in a few seconds, but if you are in your development flow, always waiting these few seconds is just too long, I believe. And then in both cases, it doesn't help you that much. And for that reason, actually what I would advocate for, and you're absolutely right, we need something in Jakarta, is to have a way, maybe something similar to test containers, where we have a standardized way just to start up an application. Something like even from Java, right? That you say, my container, Jakarta or Quarkus, start, or something like that, where you can have this in a similar approach, and maybe something like a standardized Achillean. And I think that's a follow-up question, how to create integrated tests like IT for Maven. Yes, with fake database, with some external client modes, it's impossible. Achillean is dead. Yeah, kind of agree with Achillean. It was always a little bit harder to configure. I mean, just to be honest, that's true. With some external client mock, with fake database, it depends what you want to test. If you want to test mainly the integration for trying out purposes, like I'm writing this client now and I want to see whether it works, then I would use some integration test that actually doesn't even start up your application. So for example, with either a client, that would mean that you literally only instantiate the clients and the authentication and all this, and then try to verify this on a more not integrative level, because that will be a different type of test, but the way that you only start your client and then you forget about like EE and Achillean and Spring and all of the rest. You literally just start up that environment. Or the same for databases. You can have database integration tests, like JPA integration test, where you start up your persistent context that actually works without a container, just standalone Java SE JPA, for example, for your databases, and then trying to test your persistence mapping. That's just a little bit more efficient than starting your container. So sometimes, as a middle ground, that is an efficient way. Other than that, for all of the other cases, I would advocate for system tests, like where you start your actual application, like in, containerized mode, and then just connect against it. Because I think from, looking at all of the trade-offs and all the effort you have to put in anyway, I think that's just the most efficient setup from experience. Next question. How do you prefile your database for different end-to-end test scenarios with regards to quick test execution and clean code? Yes, that is interesting. Especially a quick test execution and clean code. Depends. Prefill your database. It basically goes a little bit to what this system test is doing, wherever it is, create a coffee test, where I say, okay, create verify order and things like that. I create a coffee order, or here, create a coffee order and check for the status update. So in this case, I want to create an order, and then I need, some prerequisite state in my database. So that's a little bit similar to what you're asking, in order to do something with it. In this case, what I would do, if it's possible, I would always try to make your test idempotent, that you don't need some prerequisite state, and like your user would also not wait for something special. And for the majority of test cases, at least, that should be fine. And then you can write your tests in a way that you don't have to have them in a specific order, and that you don't have to have a lot of scripts up front. If you do have some specific cases like this where they have to be executed in order, or where you need a special case, then actually I think it goes into the same direction of running your system tests in an easier way like this. I would then just provide different ways how to start your application with either different, starting SQL scripts into your database, or having something like a test suite that is just very rigid, where you say one test after another, and then as a setup or at before and after, you basically quickly execute scripts directly against your database. I think that is, so from experience, that is actually the fastest ones, right? Because databases are fast, and instead of restarting something from scratch, if you say you have 10 different scenarios and all 10 of them need a different set of base data in the database, then I would just have 10 different scripts basically, and between each test run, where your tests are really fixed in the order, you just say, okay, database, execute this SQL, and databases are fast. So that was probably your quickest execution. If you really need a different set of test data, that would be the approach I would use for that. I have written REST API using Spring Boot. What are the different ways I should test the APIs? I only know unit testing, lost in terms, Handcrest, Mockito. Okay. Yes, so if the question is how to explain it the best way. So there's what is called a testing pyramid. Basically, the numbers of tests that you should have, or while this depends, and the level of abstraction, where you have the lower level with only code level tests, where you have something like JUnit tests that basically know your code, that have the connection to your production code, and you can execute something. And that is basically, well, you could call it unit testing. Then it's just the scope. So I would separate between the scope, whether small unit or multiple classes, and the way to test, so code level or system level. And on a code level, you can have just unit test a single unit, test one class, test multiple classes. These use case tests that I was referring to are basically multiple Java classes that I'm testing, and I wire them together, but only in Java. And then what you do, you could call it unit test or use case. That's just a name, but you still have code level tests. And then what you do, you're referring to Handcrest and Mockito. These are some test technologies that help you in mocking, spying, and matching. So things like, assert that this is equal to that. So basically say, if this is not equal to that, make my test fail. Just think of it's a helper that helps you writing this code easier, right? I could also say plain Java, get order loaded order, and if this field is not equal to that, throw exception. If that field is not equal to that, throw exception. You can have it very, plain up front, but it would not help you much, right? So this is why that is for. For Mockito, it's the same. I do have a Mockito test here. Basically just saying, okay, have a mock or a stub in this case, to have something like, just simulate the behavior of this class. I could also extend the class and, just simulate everything what I need for this case. But what Mockito does on a bytecode level is just it simulates this very nicely. So it's more efficient for me to write. So it's more a little bit like reflection. When I say mock this thing, and then when you will be executed with this method, then in future, please, respond in this way. Because you use mocking when you are interested in one class or component and you want to basically ignore all the rest. You say, I want to test this class, and I assume that the rest just works. So I assume, if you will be called, it just responds correctly and things like that. So that is what Mockito is for. And then the different things like system tests, that is a different approach. It's a different level, where you say, I don't care about the code now. I start up my application like I would in production, and then I test it from the outside. And then it's this thing like I test the HTTP API, like the REST API in your Spring Boot app, and then I could use curl in the command line if I want, just to test whether it reacts as expected. So that's a totally different level of testing, and this is then what the system test in my example is for. How do you test EJB stuff, especially in legacy project, especially where some folks work in very old setup? The rate of source code change is pretty high. Yes, with EJB, it really depends what you're doing. I hope you have not too much interaction or tangling with your with all of this EJB magic, where you have remote EJB calls and interceptors and whatnot. Then it becomes a little bit harder. So if you would put something like business logic in an interceptor, or depends what you're doing, then it's just a little bit hard to test, to build up a test scenario. Other than that, depends which EJB version. I would actually just go for a very plain JUnit setup, something like this. This actually uses a test. I don't think that's an EJB, yeah, but it could be an EJB, EJB3, my coffee shop here, and then I can just instantiate it class. So the less EJB magic you're using, the better, because then I could, treat it as a normal Java object, invoke a business method, mock all of the other dependencies, and so on. If you have a quite complex setup where you then would invoke some container magic and you rely on that, then you need to simulate that so that it just becomes harder. Maybe then you might use something like PowerMock that has more reflection capabilities to set and simulate these things also. But I would always start with something that you can run very basically with a JUnit, so Java only, and then just execute your code. If you have some magic, I would try to simulate that magic within your test components, and then just try to go that route, because I think you're the most maintainable with this. Again, if you have a look into these use case tests and the approach of making something reusable, like these test tuples, I think it helps you if you have a project with very frequent code changes, because then you just have to seldomly modify these classes and not all of the test classes you have. Does testing of JPA count as productive? I mean, in the past I always had to talk about JDBC, JPA, and some clients always claimed it's hard to maintain. I mean, hard to maintain is the question what you refer to with hard to maintain. So if you mean the annotations and the whole setup, how you configure the mapping in JPA, then this is actually where I think these extra JPA tests like ITs are productive, just because you don't need to start up everything in order to notice that your setup is wrong and you forgot an annotation, or you chose the wrong JPA lifecycle, or forgot transaction or whatever. Just to fall into this error faster than seeing it basically on later on. So that is why I would call it productive. And if you have to talk about JDBC and JPA, yeah, then you might. So this sounds like you're having issues with the setup, with maybe the test setup, how to connect to the test database. Then I would say it depends. That I would, to be honest, I wouldn't put too much effort into it, because then you might be more productive to have a similar setup like in production, which might be a special database or something you cannot run embedded easily or something like that. Then I think this might be more productive to quickly start your application and test it there, rather than trying to simulate something that runs in an embedded way or in a JPA test. Other than that, if testing off JPA, if you mean that you test your JPA implementation or your container, then I would say, well, I would assume that this actually, so I would test that I use it correctly, my application, but not that that the implementation works. Or in other words, you test this implicitly by having system tests, right? If you have a system test and your JPA implementation doesn't work correctly, well, you will notice. So I would say it depends on how complex your JPA setup is, I would say. How to test outgoing emails? That's a very good question. If your application itself tests emails sends emails with SMTP and all that, you can set up a mock server, like similar to what I did with this wire mock in the example. That is an HTTP mock server. So you can have a mocked SMTP server and then basically check whether that that works. So this, I think you referred to that you have basically an application that itself sends emails because you have a different protocol. So I would connect that in between, and then depending how it is connected and depending how you set up your production setup, either change the configuration or change something in your network that you actually end up at the mock server instead, at this mock SMTP email server instead of the actual production one. Or if you use an API, then like an API of an email service or something like that, well, then it's like an external system. But I think so basically, trying to test the API and use mock server for that, for example. But I think you're referring to an SMTP. That's an interesting question. It was a long time ago that I had some projects that have email integration themselves. I like the question. Yeah, this is what I would do then. And probably it also makes sense to have a few more unit tests or code level tests that just test and verify whether you put in these email templates together and all these things, whether your email looks nicely or whether the layout is correct, just to have a faster integration, right? Rather than starting up the application each time and sending the email to a mock server just to see, oh, how does it look and things like that. So I would maybe have a combination of these two things. And do you think it's advisable to use Spring Boot test for integration tests to test the REST API or use other testing frameworks instead? Spring Boot test for integration tests. No, I don't think that is advisable, at least not for testing business logic. Why? This Spring Boot test for integration test, I think you mean the code level tests where you have the Spring support for these MVC controllers and REST controllers for your REST endpoints, where you have a somewhat simulated environment to run your application. I say simulated in quotes because it's not quite the same that you would run in production. And this is where I say it's always not dangerous, but where if you test with that test scope, well, then you have to test it with the proper production code, like the actual jar file in Spring Boot or Docker container that you run later on anyway, just because there might be tiny differences, right, in the way how your application starts, how it is configured, and all these things. So ultimately, you need to test the actual production like application anyway. And then it just adds more effort for me in between. That is one thing. And actually it's the same in EE, and that is my take in general on code level integration tests. Doesn't matter of which technology. And the second thing is, if you start these tests, so with Spring tests that's also the case, if you start the test classes, then it's married to the life cycle. And then in this case, or in all these cases, you always have to wait for the application to start up. It might, you might reconfigure it to keep it running, which is always then an extra workaround. But for me, the easiest is just to keep them separate altogether and start in your case, Spring Boot app in the same way, like you would either start it in production or have some, dev tools where it runs in this development mode, just in order to have the fast feedback. And then, very similar to what I showed in this course, have a system test that tests it from the outside, that just invokes these REST calls using maybe REST template if you want in Spring in the same way to be more efficient, because that only connects against something that is already running, and that's why it's super fast. You don't have to wait for a startup then. So same approach to just separating these. And so yeah, same approach like EE here. Another question: how do you test Kafka or RabbitMQ interactions with JEE? How I would test them, it's the most effective depends how you integrate them with Kafka client like the Java API or via JMS. But probably it's the most efficient to test them in a system test also, to basically start your application including these endpoints, and then test them from that perspective. It's a broad question how you test them. So what I would do is basically saying you start your application in a similar way, and then what I would do is having a system test like that project with a Java client that basically does the same on the client side, just because it's faster to set up, Java on both sides, and then you can start that up and send your test messages or something like that. and then maybe on your system test side even have a facade over it to just say, okay, my system test says do this, do that, do this, send message, listen on Kafka consumer group or whatever, and have an abstraction layer before your client on your system test client side, which then uses maybe Java API to connect against your running application. I think that's the most efficient thing. If you have more on a code level side, then I would actually only test your business logic, and then RabbitMQ or Kafka shouldn't be integrated in that. I mean, that should be separated from your endpoint or consumer or listener to your actual business logic invocation. That's what I would do there. Sebastian, do you know the state of JSF in Jakarta? Honestly, no, I don't. Does Eclipse community have some thoughts about what you think, which things can be improved? So to be honest, I'm not super up to date on the state of JSF in Jakarta, how it will be maintained. What I see in projects, and that's in general also my recommendation, I see JSF sometimes still being used there, and in many cases it does make sense. Most people use prime phases, from what I see at least, most of my projects, and it does make sense if you have a project where you want to do something like rapid prototyping or rapid development of pages, mostly something like an admin page or a page like an internal dashboard and these things, where it doesn't really, I don't want to say matter how it looks, but where you don't have this like involvement of a lot of web developers that tell you, oh, please style this in this way, and that needs to be like super special and all these things. If you have that super customizable requirement, then JSF is not a good fit. It's a really good fit if you say, this is how my components look, and I can put them together very, very quickly. And I can build, big dashboards in the backend with form and all of these validations and things like that. It's nicely integrated still. And, for that type of productive project, you can totally use it. It's a good solution, I would say. But really, you have to think of it in this way and not saying, okay, you can sell it for everything. Of course, you can try to modify and customize everything. But then in terms of efficiency and how much time you spend, I think you won't be productive. So we're almost at the top of the 45 minutes. A lot of questions. I'm happy about that. And I would say last question now in Slido that came in. What do you think about isolation tests residing inside the main project? Isolation tests, I think and hope you mean something like these system tests, basically testing your application in an isolated way, like as a black box, right? So that would be this test of I run my application in some way in this black box, and then I connect from the outside, and then residing them inside the main project. So I hope I answered that before with the other question of why this is separated, what I have here in my system test project of these extra tests, that I have my system test down here and my production code over there, where I just separate these, not to, it's more, for me, that's more a, safety net to not accidentally reuse the wrong classes, because they should not be tied together. Right, because they should be separated in that regard, and that's why I would keep them separate here. But if it makes your life easier to say you only want one Maven project or something like that, and if you're either disciplined enough or put in some style checker that within your system test you don't import some production test classes, for example, that's quite easy. Then you can use this approach, and yeah, that's what I would do. Awesome. So these were all questions. I'm very happy to have this lot of engagement here, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed this first format of live Q&A. I think that was quite a success, I would say, and I'm very surprised that we got so many questions on the boring topic of efficient testing. And yes, it's just a topic that's close to my heart. Testing is really something that helps you. It's not something boring. It's something we would like to do. And actually, I really like to test. If you set up your tests that are maintainable and execute quickly, they help you a lot. And actually, and I've worked on very complex projects, the more complex your project gets, you only survive with tests. Without it's not possible, just because you don't know whether your code changes will have some side effects, and you will sleep much better if you have a proper test coverage and you just help maintaining it while actively contributing towards a proper test code quality and proper abstraction layers. And yeah, I just hope I just hope that helps. If you have any other questions, please, feel free to contact me there as well, and we will repeat this format. And I hope you enjoyed it. And now please stay safe, you all. Thanks a lot. Bye.